Better. All right, sounds good. I feel better. Now we can move on to Unit 5. Okay, so here's Unit 5. Now there's a lot going on this screen here. So we'll pause here for a second. I'll kind of go over some of this stuff. The first thing I want you to do is go grab a calculator. You can definitely use, you know, that's the nice part now, or we have the internet, and so there's a lot of good calculators there as well. Just make sure you find a scientific calculator. So you'll want to make sure that you have the button sine, cosine, and tangent. So it'll say SIN for sine. Sine is actually SINE, but we abbreviate. We chop the E off so that they're all 3 letters. Okay. Yeah, and that's fine, Will. Okay, that's totally fine. If you have it on your computer, that's fine. Just some sort of a scientific calculator. Now, if you want a computer version of a graphing calculator, you can grab that. I have a free version in DocSharing. So I have directions in DocSharing on how to, and I've had it in there all semester, but a free version of how to get a graphing calculator. Okay. I will also copy this link in that I have on the board, and that's an online version. Okay. Yes. That's a good point, Tristan. So you can always go down to the search menu if you have Windows 7 and just type in calculator, you know, if you're not sure where it's at, and you have a scientific calculator there. Hey, I like that statement, Ben. Coming back from Unit 1, or Unit 3, Semester 1, huh? Okay, so you're going to need that. One of the things that I filed transferred to you, if you have a graphing calculator or a scientific calculator, you don't necessarily, it probably just go for your calculator. If you don't, one of the things that I transferred to you was a chart. This is just part of the chart that I copied here so you could see. But you can also use a chart to find sine, cosine, and tangent. So the first column will give you the angle degree. So this goes down farther, but I didn't want to put the whole thing on the screen. And then you can go over and find the sine, cosine, or tangent for that particular angle. Okay? So there are some resources for you. All right, so how many of you guys, raise your hand if you've heard of SOHCAHTOA, or sine, cosine, and tangent. Have you covered this before? I know you don't have to raise your hand only if you remember it. I'm not asking if you remember how to do it. I'm just asking, does it sound familiar? Nora's the only one? Okay, no, that's okay. I just, okay, Tabitha has. Because usually we cover this in algebra as well. So that's why I'm surprised more of you haven't heard of it. Okay, well, it's a good thing we're going over it. You will see this in algebra too, in pre-calc, in calc. Okay. Oh, okay, good. There's some more green text, and Safa says yes, it looks familiar. Okay, cool. Cool. That makes me feel a little better. Now, I know this is one of those things. Okay, so when I was in brick and mortar, I had this class in algebra, and then it just worked out for some crazy reason. I had almost the exact same students in geometry the next year, and then I had them almost the exact same students in algebra 2 the following year, okay? And we started this in algebra 1, and they were like looking at me like I had 3 heads, and we were so confused. And then we got to geometry, and they're like, oh, yes, I remember this, I kind of don't remember how to do it, but I do remember it. And then algebra 2, we didn't even have to go over the chapter because they already had it down. So my point is, you have to practice this. That's really how you're going to absorb the steps here. When we first go over this, this is typically a concept that students struggle with. But once you get it, you get it. So it's just one of those that I promise you, if you practice enough, if you aren't getting it and you're still struggling with it, that just means you haven't practiced enough yet. Because I promise you, you will get this. Okay, you just have to keep practicing. So definitely use your problem sets, you know, and go over those questions quite a bit before you take the quizzes. Okay. Okay. So what is it? What am I even talking about? Well, we're talking about sine, cosine, and tangent, and you will hear these referred to as trigonometric ratios, or trigonometry. So when you hear trigonometry, now you know what they're talking about. They're talking about sine, cosine, and tangent. And there's definitely more trigonometry topics than this, but this is usually where we start. Okay? what these are used for is to find sides or angles of a right triangle. So that's one thing I want you to remember right away. These are only applicable to right triangles. So you'll notice here on the screen there's a little right angle symbol there, okay? And then they are ratios because they involve fractions. So remember, ratio is just a fancy word for fraction. And the sine, the cosine, and the tangent are different fractions depending on which sides of the triangle you have information about. So SOHCAHTOA is a memory help to help you remember what these ratios are. So here's how SOHCAHTOA works. And then you can, if you don't like SOHCAHTOA, think of other things. But I'll explain how SOHCAHTOA works so that you can see what I'm talking about. So the S stands for sine. Okay, so it's just telling you, okay, here's what the sine ratio is. It's the opposite side over the hypotenuse. Okay, and you can see that over here. Both of these sine ratios, I'll tell you in a second, the A and the B, but it's the opposite over the hypotenuse, the opposite over the hypotenuse. Okay? Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of the, yeah, I know what you're saying. That's kind of what that is going for. It sounds like an Indian name. So like I said, if that doesn't make sense to you, you can think of something else to help you remember the ratios, but this is the most common one you'll hear. Okay? So the sine ratio, to form the sine ratio, you're going to take the opposite side and put it over the hypotenuse. Okay? C, what do you think the C stands for? If S stood for sine, what do you think C stands for? Yeah. Hey, and I love that you spelled that whole thing out, Nora. Very nice. So cosine, yep, if you spell the whole thing out as C-O-S-I-N-E. But we usually just write C-O-S, we abbreviate it. But that's cosine, good. And if you notice over here, it's the ratio of the adjacent over the hypotenuse. So that's what the A and the H stand for. The adjacent side and the hypotenuse. Okay. And then T, you can probably guess. Yes, good. Tangent. And it's the opposite side of the triangle over the adjacent side. Okay? So that's what SOHCAHTOA is. It's a mnemonic just to help you remember all these ratios over here. Okay? Okay, so now let's talk about the ratios. The first thing that you want to remember is that you're going to need three items, three things to plug into each of these ratios. The first thing you're going to need is an angle. So sine A, sine B, the A and the B here are referring to the angles. Okay? So if you remember, and this is back from semester 1, we labeled angles with capital letters, A, B, C, on this picture, for example. So next to the sine or the cosine or the tangent, you're always going to have an angle. Now, I will give you a heads up here. I will tell you this is one place, very common place to mess up. A lot of students will not write anything. They'll write tangent and then the equal sign, or cosine and the equal sign. You're going to get messed up if you forget to put your angle in there. So sometimes you'll have a number, you'll know what the angle is. Sometimes you'll have a letter because you'll be missing the angle. Either way, you have to put something in there. You can't just write cosine equals. It has to be cosine of an angle, tangent of an angle, sine of an angle. Okay? So that's one of the three things. Right, Will. Very good point. We'll get there in a second. You're correct, though. Okay? And then the other two things you need are the two pieces you need to make that fraction. These two things making up the fraction are always sides. So you notice over here, and I'll see how these are all lowercase. Those are referring to the sides of the triangle. Okay? So you need one angle, and you need two sides. Three pieces total. If you don't have three things, you're missing something. Okay? Now, once we get that plugged in, we're going to need to be able to solve it. There's always a missing thing, right? So think back, if we have three things that we're plugging into the formula, how many things can be missing if we're going to be able to solve it? You can only have how many missing things? Yes, well, you can only have one missing thing in order for algebra to work, right? Until you get to algebra 2, but we'll leave that for Algebra 2. So you can only have one missing thing. So that means that you need to know 2 out of those 3 things to be able to solve it. Okay? Keep that in mind. The reason that I say that is because that's going to help you figure out whether you use the sine, the cosine, or the tangent. Okay? Because you can form any of these ratios. However, some ratios, if you write it out, you might look at it and you're like, oh, I'm missing 2 things. That's not good. That means that's not the one I want to use. Okay? So just use algebra as your guide. Remember, if you plug in, if you say, oh, I think I use sine, and you plug everything in and you look at it and you're like, oh, I'm missing more than one thing, then scratch that. Try cosine or tangent. Okay? So yes, Will brings up a good point. You're never going to use the right angle. So you'll notice here we don't have sine C, cosine C, or tangent C at all. Okay? That's the right angle. The sine, cosine, and tangent are only going to be from your 2 acute angles. Okay? So make sure you note that. So I know we've spent a lot of time just on this one slide. There's lots of little details, and that's why I say practice makes perfect with these. Once you've practiced enough, these details will become second nature, and then this won't be so difficult. But at first it's hard because there are so many little things you have to remember and put together. Okay? So, SOHCAHTOA is one mnemonic. Last year I had a student that thought of this. Some of her children are having trouble over algebra. So this is the ratio for sine. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine, adjacent over hypotenuse. Tangent, opposite over adjacent. Okay? So you can think of something else. If you don't like SOHCAHTOA, I just want you to be able to remember the ratios somehow. But I will use SOHCAHTOA a lot. So if you can get used to that one, that's the one you'll, just because that's what I learned and it works for me, so that's what I use. Okay? Oh, cool, Ben. Hey, I like that you're just experimenting with that. Yeah, and we can do, I guess I should say, you can do sine, cosine, and tangent of different angles, even a right angle, but we'll get to that later in Unit 5. Okay, so for now, just remember, for the purposes of a right triangle, you only want to do sine, cosine, or tangent on one of the acute angles. Okay? All right. Okay, so what I want you guys to do just really quick, just to make sure your calculator's in the right mode, type in sine of 52 and see if you get this decimal. If you're not getting this decimal, you're probably in radian mode and not degree mode. Now on the computer, I'm not sure how you would change that. I'm assuming probably you're going to get this. If you're not getting that, let me know. Yes, Will. So yeah, if you try tangent, yeah. So that's why I say, Will, that the right angle won't work there. And as you go farther, I'm not going to go into the whys of that in this class because it's kind of beyond the scope of this class. Once you get into pre-calc, that'll probably be the first time where you'll figure out why that is. But for now, just don't do that. Okay, that's what I'm going to say. Just do the acute angles. Okay, good. Oh yes, and there's more, Tristan. But okay, so check that out. If you're having trouble with that, give me a call or come to tutor time and I can help you individually with your calculators. But that's what you should get if your calculator's in the right mode. Okay? Try one more. Try cosine of 19. You should get 0.9455 something. Okay? So if you're not getting those, let me know and I will help you. Okay, the flowchart. This is another thing that I file transferred to you. And this is going to be very helpful once we get all the way through Unit 5. There's going to be a lot of information coming at you. Like I said, the trig ratios themselves are pretty challenging, but we're also going to go over the sine rule and the cosine rule, and you need to know when to apply which one. And so this flow chart, we'll come back to this, and I'll show you how to use this as we get farther into Unit 5, but for now just save it and have it for later. Okay, so right now we're only going to be going down this branch. Okay, caution to you, do not round until the final step of your answer. Okay, If you need to write it out on paper, at the most, only round to the 4th decimal place. Okay, so for example, if we go back to here, if you can keep all of those, that would be great. At the most, do 0.9455 until you are at your final answer, because you'll get errors if you round more than that. Okay, so just don't round too much with these questions until you have the final answer. Okay, now let's actually do one. I've been telling you all about them for like 15 minutes now, and you're like, come on, let's get with it. Okay, so I'm going to do these with you probably today because we don't have a lot of time left, and I want to try and get you as familiar with these as possible. All right, so the first question says, find the length of QR. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put an X over there to show that's the side I'm looking for. When we get the final answer for QR, we'll round it to the nearest hundredth, but we're not going to round to the nearest hundredth until the very last step, okay? Second thing you want to do is you want to label your sides. Now what I mean by that, so remember, SOHCAHTOA. Write out SOHCAHTOA. That would be a good first step. Write out SOHCAHTOA. And when I say label your sides, I'm referring to the opposite, the adjacent, and the hypotenuse, okay, so that we know which ratio we're going to need, sine, cosine, or tangent. So, okay, well, let's start with hypotenuse. Hypotenuse is never going to change. Where's the hypotenuse? You guys already know this. So it's always the same for a right triangle. Where's the hypotenuse? RP, yep, 12.9, right? It's always across from the right angle, okay, so I'm going to label that with an H, okay? Now, the opposite side and the adjacent side can change. What you're going to look at is one of the acute angles. Now remember how I said you're going to need 3 things in these ratios, and you only want one thing to be missing, right? So I have a choice to use either angle R or angle P. Take a look at the triangle. Which one do you think, just intuitively, which one do you think I'd probably want to go with? Would I want to go with angle R or angle P? Yeah, you guys got it, because I know what angle P is, right? I have some information about it. So that would be the smart choice here. So from angle P, so in other words, first you have to determine what angle you're using in order to be able to label the opposite side and the adjacent side, okay? Now from angle P, what side is opposite angle P? That's what opposite means. It means what side is opposite the angle that you're going from. Good, QR. So just like with the hypotenuse, you just look across on the other side of the triangle, and that's your opposite side. Adjacent, in my experience with students, seems to be best left till the last. Adjacent is just a fancy word for next to. Okay, so it has to be side QP, right? That's the only one that's left. But for some reason it's easier for students usually to find the hypotenuse first and then the opposite side, and then whatever's left is adjacent. It just means it's next to the angle. You'll notice another way to think about it too is the hypotenuse and the adjacent side will always form the angle that you're using. Okay, so if you've already figured out the hypotenuse, then the other side that makes up that angle has to be the adjacent side. Okay? All right, now let's take a look at what we know. So we know 12.9, we know 63. So we definitely want to include those. Okay, so we definitely want to include the hypotenuse. We definitely want to include angle P. That's 2 things. Now the third thing, okay, remember in the ratios, what things do we have? We have 2 sides and what else? In these ratios, sine, cosine, or tangent. Do you remember back? Let's go back. We have 2 sides that make up the ratio. What else do we need? Good, the angle measure. Yep. Okay, so those are the 3 things. So don't forget that. You need 1 angle and you need 2 sides. Okay, so we have 1 angle and we have 1 side. What do we still need? We have 1 angle, we have 1 side. What else do we still need? 1 more side. Absolutely, Yusuf. Perfect. Okay, which side do you think I want? Do you think I want the opposite or the adjacent? Okay, why QR, Sarah? That's correct. Why not QP? Why QR instead of QP? Exactly, because that's what we're looking for. So we better have it in the equation, right? If we don't have it in the equation, how are we going to find it? Okay, so you have to, that's what I'm saying. This is difficult because I can't give you step 1, you do this. Step 2, you do this. I can in a general sense, but ultimately you're going to have to think through this. Okay, you've got to put on your thinking cap and think what makes sense, because every question is going to be a little bit different. So I'm going to circle what we are going to include. We're going to include the hypotenuse, we're going to include the opposite side, and we have this angle. Look at SOHCAHTOA. Which one involves the opposite side and the hypotenuse? Which ratio has O and H in it? Excellent, good. So remember the S, the C, and the T stand for sine, cosine, and tangent. These 2 items that come after that stand for the sides. Do you guys see how the S, the O and the H come after the S? Okay, that means that's the one we want to go with, because those are the 2 sides that I have circled here, the O and the H. So I write out sine. What comes after sine? Before the equal sign, what do I need? Next to the sine, the cosine, or the tangent. What do you always have next to the sine, the cosine, or the tangent? Good, Ben. The angle. The angle that we're using, we know it in this case, so it's going to be 63 degrees. Okay? And then you put in your O over H, your opposite and your hypotenuse. Okay? Here, actually, let me back up. And before we plug in the 63, you're totally right, Ben, but I'll write it in terms of the letters. Okay? So we're going to do sine of angle P equals the opposite side over the hypotenuse, because those are the 3 things that I have circled in blue. Now I plug in what I know. I have sine of 63, the opposite side is x, and the hypotenuse is 12.9. Okay? Do you see how that works? Okay. Now, if you know the sign, you're going to type this in your calculator. So tell me what the sine of 63 is to 4 decimal places. Okay, 8910. Everybody else get that? Right. Yeah, but I would go ahead and write the 0 just because I'm emphasizing that you want to write to the 4th decimal place. But yes. Okay. All right, now it's algebra. Algebra 1. So I want to solve for x. That means I want to multiply by 12.9, or I'll put parentheses instead of the dot. And so you're going to take 0.8910 and multiply by 12.9, and that's your answer. So what do you get? $11.49. Okay, perfect. And yes, at this point, this is our final answer. This is x. Now we can round to the nearest hundredth, which is 2 decimal places. Good. And we should put units. It's a side length and it gives us units of centimeters, so we should put that in our final answer. Okay? Oh, we ran out of time. I was worried that we would. I kind of had a feeling we would. It's 11:15. But what we'll do, you'll notice one thing that I did file transfer to you is more videos on Unit 5, so you can check those out. I also have recordings from last year that are already posted for you. And like I said, if you're taking PARCC next week, I would highly recommend you going ahead and taking a look at those videos anyway. Just so, because we're not going to get through all of Unit 5 before you take that, and I have a feeling that some of this stuff's going to be on there. But we will finish up next time if we can, and I will give you this extra credit for now. But those are some resources out there for you. And of course,